Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to use Claude Code to write the same application 3 different times using increasingly specific and detailed prompts. Now, this is the first time I've written an entire application using AI, but I've been building applications the old school way for over 20 years, so I'm curious to see how AI stacks up. The application I'm going to build is a very simple one. It allows you to create lists of items like grocery lists, to-do lists, that kind of thing. Now, this is a very common example used for showing off different frameworks and different programming languages. So the AI should probably be pretty well trained on this kind of application. So I'm really giving it the best chance at success to build a good application right out of the gate. So let's go ahead and get started. For the first attempt, I'm not going to give it any instructions about the tech stack, about what programming language to use. All I'm going to tell it to do is write the application. I'm going to specify it's a web application, and I'm going to give it the features that I want this application to have. So I'm going to pull up Claude Code, and I'm going to give it the simple prompt and see what it generates. So after a quick minute, it built out an application for us. Pretty cool. So the end result is pretty simple but functional. It's just a browser-only application. It's using local storage to store all the data. But I pull it in my browser and it worked immediately. When I browse through the code, it looks pretty well structured. I can follow everything that it's doing. It's interesting that it chose JavaScript classes instead of some functional methods, but I guess that's what Claude Code prefers, or at least in this instance it did. Mobile responsiveness is there, but honestly, it's a little bit ugly in mobile, but still, it tried to make it responsive. That's a plus. I mean, overall, I'd call this a success. It followed my instructions. It built an application. Obviously, it's not something I would deploy out because there's no actual persistence. I wouldn't be able to share it between computers. That's actually my goal with this. But for a first try, pretty cool. All right, let's move on to the second attempt. So I'm going to be using the same prompt I used before, but now I'm going to go ahead and add more information about the tech stack that I want. In this case, I know that I want it to be deployed out to a shared server that I already have, and that's going to be using a LAMP stack. So in other words, it's PHP running in Apache. That's for the server side, and then the actual database is going to be MySQL. So I add that to the prompt. I enter it into Claude Code in a brand new project, so it starts from scratch again, and go ahead, let it run for a few minutes and see what it spits out. All right, so now that the code has been generated, I want to be able to run this code locally. So instead of trying to install MySQL and Apache and PHP, I'm just going to use, I already have Docker installed inside my WSL prompt here. So I'm going to tell Claude Code to build me a Docker Compose file, and I'll go ahead and use Docker to run this application. So second prompt is going to use Docker Compose. And there we go. I now have a Docker Compose file. I have to make a couple edits to my config, and now I can try running the application, and it immediately fails. Let's see. So if I pull up the initial query in the network browser, I see that that's failing due to an HT access issue. So go look at the logs in the server in the Docker Compose, and it looks like the permissions of one of the folder is wrong. So I fix that real fast, and let's try again. And now there's a new problem. It looks like the loader and the new list modal are not hiding. So again, let's go ahead and look at the console. Nothing's wrong there. Let's look at the classes on the loader element. And interestingly, the hidden class isn't actually hiding the loader. It's being overridden by the other classes. So the quick and easy fix for that is just go into the style and change that, or add a bang important to the class. And it looks like that fixes part of the problem, but there's still another problem. Going down to the items isn't working. This one's a little bit more subtle. It looks like the issue is the HT access file is accepting anything after lists or items in the API folder and redirecting that to itself. So then it gets that same, it matches that same directive over and over again until it hits a recursion limit and then errors out. I'm going to go ahead and edit this regular expression in the htaccess file, make it more specific. So it's always expecting just a single value after lists and items, and that should fix the problem. And it does. So now we're able to actually see what it looks like. So some pros about this approach, some things I like the way it did. It decided to split the code up into a REST API for the server side, and then the front end part is just a UI with vanilla JavaScript acting as kind of like an SPA, like a single page application type thing. That's pretty cool. That's how I would have done it. So that's a great approach. I liked that it knew to use HT access because we're running in Apache. This way it could rewrite the requests and make it look prettier. The Docker Compose was nice. I just told it to make me a Docker Compose file and it did it for me. That's a definite time saver. Now for some of the cons I've found. There's a couple places in the code where it uses or it added some automatic CORS headers, but the CORS headers it specified are definitely too permissive. That would be some security problems, especially if you're doing something that required or included into authentication. You're kind of opening the keys for malicious websites to hijack your user sessions and do things maliciously. There's definitely more elegant ways to do this. I'm not going to go into that too much now, but the core stuff is pretty naive and should be improved. The input checking on the PHP side, the server side, is again pretty naive. You can see here that if you enter in a number, it works fine. But if you enter in a number with some letters, it just parses out the beginning numbers. 1 TTT, 2 TTT. That really should be rejected. The server should not accept those. Similarly, if you have a path here, it's only looking at the first part of the path and ignoring everything after that. These should all be 404s. With all these extra numbers at the end, that's not a valid URL. So the server side could be improved for some input checking. Additionally, just the code structure. There's a lot of repeated code, especially where it's doing validation checking or verifications about the whether a list exists. That should be pulled up into its own method just so that, number one, you're not repeating yourself. That's, one of the core principles of don't repeat yourself. But in this case specifically, it's, that's a security check. And if you end up having to fix that security check, you want to only fix it in one spot. Otherwise, if someone finds a bug in one particular method of the security problems and fixes it only there, that same problem will exist in the other 6 places in your code that you wrote those exact same lines of code. So if you pull that up into one single method, if you find a security problem with that particular check, you only fix it once and for free, you get it fixed everywhere else. Looking at the front end side of things, it's again interesting that it shows object-oriented JavaScript and instead of going functional. It's odd that Claude Code keeps choosing that. I personally prefer functional unless you need to use classes, but it looks like Claude just keeps picking the object-oriented ones. Additionally, there's no way out of the box here to bundle or minify any of the code. So the HTML is not minified. The styles, the scripts, which this is a pretty small application. But if it were to grow, you'd want a way to be able to minify that code, the style sheets, the HTML. Just something nice to have that this didn't provide. But it's this does work. So again, pretty cool that once the issues that were initially there were fixed, the code does work. Again, it looks like they did do some mobile responsiveness, which again is great that it's tackling that. So yeah, again, I'm pretty impressed, especially the fact that it shows to use a REST implementation out of the gate. That's great. All right, third attempt. This time I'm going to strongly manage the entire process with the end goal of trying to get it to be fully deployable out to my shared hosting site. So the first prompt I'm going to do is tell it to build out the back end using a REST API type approach with PHP. I'm going to let Claude Code run my prompt, and after a couple minutes of chewing on it, I now have the basic application. I realized after it was done that it put all the files into the top level of the deployable folder, which I actually want that to be under. Everything in this part should be under API. So another quick prompt, I had it refactor that to move that down one more folder. This way the top level can be used for the UI. So then I wrote the third prompt, which is telling it to generate the UI. And I want that to actually be separated out from the backend information. This way it can go through like a bundler and I can have separate files and additional organization. So I'm going to let that prompt run for a couple minutes. This surprisingly took the longest part, but after a couple minutes, it spit out the files I wanted to. It decided to use Vite, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, as the bundler. And now I just need to be able to run it. So I'm going to go ahead and use Docker Compose again. This time I just copied the Docker Compose from the previous step, changed a few things on the file to point to the correct location, and got it up and running without any problems. So when I first tried to run it, I ran into a similar permission issue as the last time. For some reason, it didn't create the new directory as world readable. I'm sorry. So I had to fix that, and then I actually messed up the config in my file. I didn't change it to match the Docker Compose file. I fixed that, and after that, it worked immediately, which was great. So let's take a look at the final result. Again, it's nice that I told it to make a REST API and it actually followed real REST conventions. Interestingly, it had the same mistake with the cross-origin headers. It's making them too permissive. It's accepting all origins when you should lock that down to just the server that you're running on. Again, it seems like that's something that Claude Code has a blind spot towards. Same as last time, input validation wasn't as good. If I pull up the API, you can see that if you do add those letters after the numbers again, it's using the wrong validation. It's ignoring those letters, treating it as just the numbers at the beginning. That should be fixed. One thing I don't like about the code organization, which is just more of a personal thing, the index.php, the kind of what they're calling the router inside of the Claude Code, that's doing all of the routing work. I would prefer it to delegate once you so if you have the lists top level route, that should just delegate over to the list controller, and then that can decide how to handle get, post, put, delete, and any type of sub route underneath it. That would just be a better way to organize the code, in my opinion. Additionally, if you go look at the list item controller, they're using classes in all of these code, and I'm not sure. Personally, I'm not a big fan of using classes either for this. It's not really that needed. You're only running through the code once every time you run the code. I don't know why you need classes, especially for for instance, the database initialization. That's just wrapping a class around a class. It seems silly, but in the list item controller specifically, that one is not even using classes correctly. If you notice, every single method requires a list ID. Well, why shouldn't that just be part of the constructor? This way, anytime you're working on items, it should belong to a list. If you're going to use classes, that should be one of the first things you pass in, instead of requiring it for every single method in there. That's just an example of an odd decision by Claude that is kind of a rookie-ish mistake. Let's see. The UI, let's go take a look at that now. It works, which is great. The functionality is all there. I'm not actually crazy about the design of it. I actually like the other two versions better than this one. Having the UI, like the lists on the side, I don't know, seems a little clunky to me. But then let's go into mobile view, and this is really ugly, where you have the lists at the top. You have to scroll through. You only see one and a tiny bit more than it. I don't know. I'm not really a fan of the overall design and the flow. But that's something that you could easily be improved with further iterations. At least it works, right? Additionally, I just noticed that the date and the times that are specified in here, they're actually wrong. They're not wrong, but they're stored in MySQL as UTC, and I'm not in UTC zone. I'm in Central Time Zone of the U.S. And so you can see that it's showing it 5 hours off from when I actually recorded this. So basically, the server should be passing the time zone back to the client, and the client should then be intelligently interpreting that into the local time zone of the user. It looks like, looking at the data, that the server is actually just passing it back without any time zone. So that would have to be fixed as well. Time zones are often that's where a lot of mistakes happen. And from at least from my experience, that's something that gets a little bit tricky, dealing with time zones in the back end and getting them to the front end and making sure everything's translated and it's shown correctly to the user. And it looks like Claude Code kind of stepped in that trap there as well. And Yeah, again, looking at the JavaScript on the front end, third time in a row, JavaScript's chosen to use object-oriented JavaScript instead of functional. I don't know if maybe I'm missing something, but I personally prefer functional JavaScript. I wonder if there's a way to like tell Claude Code globally, when you're working in my projects, prefer functional. I have to look into and see if there are ways to kind of give directives to Claude. But anyway, just a personal observation there. It works again, so it's that's the important thing, right? I wouldn't if this was something that had come to me as a pull request, I wouldn't be making any comments or rejecting it. But it's if I was writing the code myself, I wouldn't have chosen to go with classes. All right. So those are all three applications, and honestly, I'm pretty impressed. I wasn't expecting it to go as quickly and as smoothly as it did. Yeah, aside from a few small problems, the code just worked out of the box. I don't know how much these problems would have hung up, brand new developers or people not familiar with the technology, but they weren't that big of a deal. And once you get past them, everything did work correctly. Obviously, like I said, there are some validation things that could be improved. There's definitely a potential security issue, especially if you start adding in things like authentication. Um, Input validation that could be improved, but these are all things that could be figured out while you're testing if you have a good testing mindset and figure out these problems. And presumably if you could just tell Claude to fix it, and it will probably know how to fix it. That's maybe a future video. I'll actually go through and pick one of these and see if I can iterate on it and get it to work better. So yeah, rough around the edges, but functional. I wouldn't release it this way, but it's well on its way to making it into something that I could release, especially the third version. I mean, the third version is something that I could build into a bundle, package it up, and then send it over to a server, which is pretty cool. So all in all, I'd call this experiment a success, and I had fun testing out the AI. If you want to see the code that was generated along with the prompts I used to generate them, I'll put them up on my GitHub account, and I'll include links in the description below. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing, and thanks again for watching. See you next time.